So at this point, it's time to actually begin working with Unity. I have here the desktop, and what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and open up Unity. Now, if this is your first time opening Unity, the screen you're going to see is going to be a little bit different than this screen. So if you're opening up Unity and you see this screen, that's fine. If you don't see this screen, just hold on a second. We're going to come to File, New Project, and this is going to be the screen that you should be seeing. This is our project window that allows us to determine where our project is going to be saved, what it's going to be called, and any assets that we want. I'm going to browse to a new location, and I'm going to choose the desktop, and I'm going to choose projects here. Now you can put this wherever you want, just remember where you put it, that's important. And I'm going to call this one sample project, just like that. And then I will select that folder, and my new project will be called sample project. You can name it whatever you want, but just place it somewhere you'll remember it and give it a name that you'll remember. What we have here is a list of all of the assets that we can import. Now, I want to caution you against just clicking through here and I want that, I want that, I want that. We definitely don't want to do that because it's going to affect the size and performance of our projects. So we really only want to bring in any assets that we know that we're going to use. I generally don't bring in any assets to start, and I just grab them as I need them inside the project so that I don't have assets that I'm not going to use just cluttering things up and getting in the way. So what we have here is we have our sample project, and I'm not going to pick any assets, I'm just going to select create. That's going to create our project for us. We'll see that the editor will open back up. Now, what we have here is the traditional editor layout. We're going to look at the different elements, but I do want to pay special attention real quick here to this assets folder. This is where everything game related is going to go. And I want to show you how it parallels with the actual folder structure of the project itself. So I'm just going to go ahead and minimize this project real quick here. And I'm going to find the projects folder that I saved my sample project to. So here's my sample project. You'll see now that if I open it, there's all these different folders in here. But the one I am focusing on is this assets folder. Anything I put in here in the editor will appear in here in the Explorer. Likewise, anything I put in this folder in the Explorer or the File Manager will appear in the Unity editor. Changes to one will affect changes to the other. It's very easy if you need to bring some file into your project. All you really need to do is click and drag it into this folder and boom, it's in your project, right? So it becomes very simple to maintain the assets of our different projects. Okay, so let's get back to the Unity editor here and let's look at the different elements of the Unity editor. Now what we have here is a layout with a bunch of different tabs. So we can see all the different tabs here inside the Unity editor. We can move these tabs around, we can change our layout, but we're going to go over what each tab does first, and then we'll look at maybe an optimal way of placing our tabs so they work for us. It's all about personal preference. I'm going to set it up a certain way. You're welcome to do it the same way. However, if you find a way that works better for you, that makes more sense to you, go ahead and use it that way. It's entirely up to you. So I'm going to start with this project view. This project tab right down here is going to show me everything that's currently available in my project. It's not going to show me everything that's necessarily in my current scene. It's just going to show me the things that are in my project. So I have here right now just assets. And if I wanted to add items, I could right click on that and create. I could create new folders. I could create all of these different items. I don't want to get into any of this stuff just yet though. Another neat thing that's relatively new is this favorites section right here. Now the favorites section, when I click this, allows me to see any assets that I have selected as a favorite, which is really nice. As our folders get bigger and bigger and bigger, we can select some favorites, some things that we need to access more often. Another thing about the favorites that's really nice is, let's say I want to use a robot in a game, and I don't necessarily have a robot model. Well, I can select the asset store right here from inside the editor, and I can see under my free assets all of these different things that are available to me. And of course, right here, Robot Kyle, probably my favorite model on here. A Robot Kyle is available, and we can see here the price is in fact free. I can also explore paid assets and so on and so forth. So we can see all the things in the Unity store. We can do that for models, we can do that for materials, prefab scripts. I don't want to get into what all that stuff is just yet, but we have a lot of access to the different assets available to us through this project tab. Right next to the project tab is this console. If I click on that, we see nothing, effectively. The console is where the output of different things like logging and stuff like that appears to us. Any errors that we might have will appear here inside the console. Later on, it's going to become very important to check the console to see, what it says, to see maybe any errors that we're having or any output that we're particularly looking for. So the console will become very important once we get into things like scripting. So let's look at the hierarchy view. The hierarchy tab is this tab right here, and it will show us everything that is in our scene. Now currently, we don't have anything in our scene but a camera. Unity always starts with a camera in our scene. And you can see once I click that, a lot of things happen. We got some lines here in our scene view. We got some information here in our inspector. We'll look at all that in due time. We also have a search bar here that allows us to search through our hierarchy to find the different elements that are in there. When a game or a project is running, we're going to see the hierarchy gets full of a lot of stuff. And so being able to search through that is very useful for finding the items that we need. We can also from here create new items to appear inside our hierarchy. Again, I'm not going to work with any of that stuff just yet. So we want to make sure you are aware that it is there. So we have the scene view here. Now, the scene view is this tab, and this is going to show us basically all of the stuff that's currently in our scene. In Unity, a scene is kind of synonymous with a level, right? So if I had 3 levels, I'd create 3 different scenes and put all the items in there. It's an easier way of organizing. So my scene view is going to help me look at all that stuff. Now I'm going to actually navigate around in my scene view a little bit. We can see that just by clicking and dragging, we're kind of moving stuff around. I want to show you some of these different items, and I can't show those to you without adding an item to the scene. So I'm going to come to game object, I'm going to create other, and I'm going to select a cube. We're going to see this cube appear, and I'm going to get a little bit closer to the cube. The reason I have this cube here is so that I can show you some of the different elements of this scene view. The first element I want to look at in the scene view here is my ability to change my render modes. So right now I'm selecting texture rendered mode, which is going to render whatever texture is currently on the object. In case you don't know, render is a term that means to draw. So we're basically drawing whatever texture's on there. Since it's a basic cube, the texture is just white, so it doesn't look like anything particular. But if I wanted to ignore the texture and see the wireframe, I could click wireframe here. The wireframe shows me the lines that make up this object. If you recall previously, I said everything was made up of triangles. We can actually see the triangles that make up this cube. I can also choose textured wire, which shows me the texture and the wireframe. I can do something called render paths, which shows me the different rendering paths. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular talk. And light map resolution, which again, this object does not have a light map, so we're not going to see anything specific there. So I'm going to come back to texture here because that's the default way of looking at objects. Next, I want to look at this thing called RGB. RGB stands for red, green, blue, and with RGB selected, it's going to show me all the normal colors of that object. This object's a bit boring, it's white, but we can see its color is white with the RGB view. I could also go alpha view, in which we're going to basically see everything go grayscale. We haven't chosen alpha value, so obviously there's not going to be much to see there. We can do overdraw, which is going to draw everything translucent or almost transparent. Overdraw helps us find areas where objects overlap each other. We can use that to kind of move objects so we don't have a lot of overlap. And finally, we have mip maps, which is going to talk about texture resolution. And again, that's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular video. So I'm just going to come back to RGB and we're going to leave it at that. Now I'm going to jump over here to this thing called perspective, or PERSP, that stands for perspective. Right now, our scene view is rendering with a perspective, and what that means is objects are drawn as if they would actually look. Things get smaller the further away they are from us, things get bigger the closer they are. There's a slight parallax effect, things that the human eyes see and recognize as 3D. If I click on perspective, I change it to ISO, and what we see now is that the block looks very strange because it's being rendered completely without perspective. Everything is being drawn as if it was parallel and not as if it was cone-shaped like it was being viewed by our eyes. Most of the things we do in scene view we're going to do with perspective, obviously because it's a lot easier to work with. However, if we say a two-dimensional game where we wouldn't necessarily want perspective, we would work with ISO. So that's just what that means there. Then we have this cardinal direction tree right here. We can see the 3 axes available to us. So we can see the z-axis, we can see the x-axis, and we can see the y-axis. And then we've got this square in the middle here. Clicking on any one of these axes will move us to be effectively flush with that axis. To give you an idea, if I click on the positive y-axis, you're going to see that I'm going to move above it and look down on it, which we can see we are now above the object. I'm going to click on my cube there, and that'll help me kind of navigate to it. I can click the square again to kind of move back to a free perspective. Click it again to come back to my normal perspective mode. And again, I can click on this z-axis here to kind of be in front of it again. So we can use this cardinal direction item to navigate through the different axes of our screen and kind of align our objects in such a way. It makes moving objects and seeing where objects are much more simple. You can also see that this down here changed the word back because we're now looking at the back of it. As soon as I move, we come back to perspective. So that's going to cover talking about the directions inside the scene view. We have this other thing here called gizmos. Gizmos will tell us what will appear inside our scene mode. So if I have this item selected, you see these axes here. The x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis. These handles that we're seeing, these cones, those are called gizmos, and I can turn those on and off. If I don't want to see those, I can come in here and turn off that particular gizmo. That gives us some ability to control what we're seeing on the screen there. If I slide over from the gizmos, I see these 3 buttons right here. This first button will turn on and off audio. Alright, whether we want audio to run inside of our scene view. That's useful for when we're testing different sound sources and stuff like that, but normally we leave that off. The next allows us to turn on and off our skybox, fog, and lens flare, which are our rendered effects. We don't have any right now, but if we wanted to test what our project looks like without them, we can turn them off. And then finally we have the built-in lighting. We can turn on our lighting whether it's on and off. We can see the difference that makes. If we turn it off, we can see the more natural light if we were to have lights in our project. The next tab I want to talk about is the Game tab. So if I click here where it says Game, I'm going to see this, a blue screen with kind of this gray box. The Game tab is what we can see when we're playing the game. So this is what the one camera, this main camera here, this is what that main camera is seeing while we play our game. Obviously we have no lights, we don't have a lot of other objects, so it's a very basic, very plain looking scene right now. We play the game inside this Game tab. We can choose the way this game will render by changing a few things on here. So the first thing we can do is we can change its free aspect. We can change its aspect ratio. So free aspect will just show us whatever this box will actually show us. As we make the box bigger, it'll show us more or less. We can also choose a specific aspect ratio. So if I wanted to make my game in 16:9 aspect ratio, I could click that, and I am limited to seeing only 16:9 aspect ratio. Finally, I can choose a specific aspect ratio. I can determine the exact size if I wanted to test certain things, and we have options of all these different potential aspect ratios. But for now, we're just going to leave it in free aspect ratio. You could also leave it in 16:9, which is a very standard aspect ratio. This next item here called Maximize on Play, we haven't looked at play yet, but when we turn this on and we hit play, we go to play our game, this box, this blue Game tab, will take up actually our entire editor window as opposed to just this small Game tab. So when we want to play it, if we wanted to go effectively full screen, we would turn this Maximize on Play on. However, if we wanted to test and be able to see the console and things like that, we would leave Maximize on Play off. We can also turn on stats like the frames per second and things like that, which we can see here. We can turn those on or off. And finally, just like with the scene tab, we have these gizmos where we can turn gizmos on and off, or whether or not we want to see the different handles and the different, gizmos for lack of a better term. We'll leave that off by default. Alright, the next tab I want to talk about is this Inspector tab. The Inspector tab is going to tell us the properties of whatever item we currently have selected. So if you'll see over here, we currently have the main camera selected, and so in the Inspector tab, we have these position information, right? This is the coordinate system that we were talking about previously. We can see that the camera is at 0 in the X direction, 1 on the Y direction, so it's a little bit above the origin, and -10 in the Z direction, so it's closer to the player. So it's more about where the player would feel comfortable if the camera was the player's own eyes looking at the screen. And we can see that it's not rotated at all. It's 0, 0, 0 on its rotation. And its scale is 1, 1, 1, a normal scale. It's not increased, it's not decreased. 1 is your standard scale. We can also see that it's a camera, and we can see all the items that belong to a camera. We're not going to get into any of that stuff yet. We'll talk about that later. And we can see just some of the different components that exist with this camera. If I were to come over here to the cube and select that, then come back to my Inspector tab, we would see now my cube has a position as well. That position is very close to the origin, just slightly off of the origin. Again, has 0 rotation and a 1 scale, and some of the things that makes a cube, as we can see here. So the Inspector tab is fantastic for when we're working with our items. We need to position them, rotate them, or work with any of their components. The Inspector tab is going to be used quite a bit. Now I'm going to come back to my Scene tab. If I look up here, this is the toolbar. The toolbar has a bunch of tools that we can use to manipulate our scene. The first item here is the hand tool that will allow us to pan around our scene. So we can see that we're able to kind of change how the scene camera is looking at the scene. We're not actually moving the object itself, we are moving ourselves through the scene. So that's our pan tool. The very next tool is the translation tool, which will allow us to change the position of our object. So we can see these handles appear here, and if I were to say grab the x-axis handle, you can see that it turns yellow, and I can move it along the x-axis. This is me actually moving the cube. So if while I move this cube, if you look at the X position here in the Inspector tab, you'll see that it's changing. as I actually move it through the world. Likewise, the green is the Y direction, and the blue is the Z direction. The next toolbar tool is the rotation tool. When I click that, you're going to see these circles. Now the colors are the same, but we can see that the Y axis, which is normally up and down, is this green. So when I move it, I'm spinning it about the Y axis. Red, of course, has me spinning it about the X axis. Blue has me spinning it about the Z axis there. And in the inspector, we can see how the angles of rotation change. The next tool here is the scaling tool, which we can see allows me to scale it along the Y-axis, scale it along the X-axis, and scale it along the Z-axis. And again, we can see that the inspector items change. Here we have this button here that says center. It should say center on yours. If you click it, it goes to pivot. That just determines where the rotation happens. If we select center, we will rotate about the center of an object. If we've set up pivot points, we can rotate around the pivot points. Now this object does not have special pivot points set up, so whatever we select won't matter, but we generally leave that on center. And then finally, whether we want to work with the local coordinates or the global coordinates of an object, I'll have to come back here and select my translate tool for this to become enabled. If I click global, now I'm moving it relative to the global coordinates, and if I choose local, I'm moving it relative to the local coordinates. Last, we have these three buttons here. This is the play and pause and an escape key. We're not going to worry about this last one too much here. The play button will allow us to actually go into our game. So if I'm going to hit play real quick, and we'll see that we kind of come into the game mode. We can see that the game tab becomes the focused tab here. And we would actually be playing this game now if there was any interactivity. Pausing the game allows us to kind of come back out to inspect the different elements, in which we could just unpause it and come back into the game. And finally, by unclicking this play button here, we stop playing the game and everything sort of gets reset from there. So that's going to cover all the different tools and all the different tabs. We aren't necessarily just set and only having these tabs, however. For instance, if I wanted to have two scene tabs, I could right click on the scene tab, come to add tab, and I could choose a new scene tab. I could choose any of these tabs, but I'm going to choose a new scene tab. And I could choose a different layout for my scene tab. Maybe this scene tab I wanted to be from this side, all right, and this scene tab from this side. I can certainly do that. Another neat thing that we can do is we can manipulate our layout. So this tab doesn't necessarily have to be here. I can grab this scene tab and drag it and move it maybe over here, and now have these two scene tabs. So one looking from one angle, one looking from another angle. Now, if we make all these manipulations and we want to go back, we can certainly do that. If we come up here to Window and we choose Layouts, we can choose the default layout here, which will reset everything back to the way we were originally. If we come back to Layouts here, we can see that we can do a 2x3 layout. We can see that we can also do something like a 4 split with 4 scene views. So we have a lot of options as to how we want our windows to be set up. I'm going to come back here to Windows. I'm going to come back to Default. And I'm going to kind of move things around to the way I prefer them. And like I said, if you have a different preference, you certainly can. But I generally move the hierarchy down here to the bottom. This gives me a maximum amount of view space for my scene. And I leave my game just as a side option there. And I just make sure things are minimized down to give me as much viewable scene area as possible. Since we're going to be working so much in the scene view, we want to make that the biggest view available. Once you have a layout that you like, we can come up here to Window, Layouts, and we can save our layout. So I can choose a new layout here. This window pops up here, and I might call this Mike's layout or something along those lines. It doesn't really matter what, but I can save that. And now whenever I come to Window, Layouts, I should see Mike's layout here. So if I make some changes and I want to come back to it, I can just select Mike's layout and the window will come back to my preferred layout.